I'm certainly not the only the progress movement. Probably Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison would be the biggest best known names. They wrote the article in the Atlantic a few years ago that kind of came to pull this up. But I was writing about progress at my blog, The Roots of Progress, since a few years before even all that got started. So I was in progress before it was cool. Yeah, and so in general, I write about the history of technology and philosophy of things. And so I'm really thrilled to be here. This is only my second Vision Weekend. Loved it last year. I was here as an attendee. Very honored to come back here now as a speaker. And since it is Vision Weekend, go ahead, yeah. I want to talk about vision and specifically vision of the future. I think that all of us are here at this event this weekend because, or in large part, because we share at some level the vision of the future. And it is a bold, ambitious vision of a technological future, right? The future of nanotechnology, longevity technology, and space technology. But I think it's important that we remember every once in a while, next slide please, that this is not a mainstream vision of the future. We're kind of a unique bunch of geeks here. And you know, most people kind of aren't thinking. This seems like sort of just like a sci-fi future that is hard to believe in. Next slide. So, for instance, the Center for Growth and Opportunity put out a poll. They asked people, when should someone be born to have a thriving and fulfilling life? Right now, 200 years in the future, or 200 years in the past? And 16% of people thought that 200 years in the past was the best time. Sorry, only 16% said 200 years in the future. 17% said 200 years in the past. Notably, 42% were not sure. Sort of hope that they were vacillating between now and the future, rather than a large percentage of them thinking that maybe, you know, the past was the best time. But I'm not confident of that. Next slide, please. Because in one town in France, they're actually actively working to bring back that 200-year past by reinstituting draft horses into service. Now, you know, I don't have anything against horses. Maybe there's room for one or two of them. They make they're good for mounted police. They're good for carriage rides in Central Park. But if you read this article, it's just absolutely full of sort of glowing romanticization of the past and demonization of current technologies. Next. So, why is there this difference between the vision animating the Foresight Institute and the progress movement and this disconnect with the mainstream? Well, why do we believe in that sci-fi future? I asked myself, why do I believe in it? And when I introspect on that question, next slide, it's because I am keenly aware of the progress of the past. I know where we came from, how far we've come, how many problems we've solved, how bad life used to be, how much better we've made things. And really, if you see that progress of the past, if you're keenly aware of that, then I think that I mean, really then really I think the just thinking of that sci-fi future is just an extrapolation, really, of this. Okay, yeah, next slide. So, but the problem, I think, part of the problem in the culture today is that the problems of the past that have been solved by technology and industry are largely forgotten, and the solutions that have been put in place are largely invisible. Next slide. So, for example, just think about eating a meal. You can enjoy a gourmet dinner, or you know, a microwave burrito that you eat in one hand while you browse the news, you know, on your smartphone on your other hand, whatever it is. You can enjoy this meal without having to know or think or care about everything that goes into the system that provides this for you. You don't have to know about the combine harvester that reaps and threshes the wheat that goes into your bread or your pasta. You don't have to know about the industrial furnaces that operate at over 100 atmospheres to perform the Haber-Bosch process that synthesizes the fertilizer to grow these crops. You don't have to know about the irrigation pipelines that bring the water. So, next slide. And it's easy to forget while you're eating that meal that for most of human history, just being able to eat a meal at all was considered a gift for which people regularly gave thanks to God. And that even, say 200 years ago, I'll say it next time. Even 200 years ago, when, you know, even when we had sort of a relative amount of food security, agriculture was still highly unproductive, back-breaking manual labor, long hours in the fields. Next slide. So Repeat this for every industry and every sector of the economy, right? You can live an entire life and enjoy all the comforts of modern industrial civilization without ever knowing or thinking about power plants that generate your energy, the cargo supply chain that brings your goods, the research labs that create the life-saving vaccines and medicines. And the problems of the past are largely forgotten. We don't have to see the manure in the streets, which is part of why we got rid of those draft forces. We fortunately, in most of the world, don't have to see children stricken by polio or other epidemics that rip through our society. Next slide. So I fear that industrial civilization is at risk of becoming a victim of its own success. It has solved the problems of daily life and work so thoroughly and with such finesse that those problems and their solutions are starting to fade from our collective memory. Next slide. Like fish in water, we are so completely surrounded by technology, living in it and with it and through it and completely dependent on it every day of our lives, that it just recedes into the background. Next slide. But I don't think that this is inevitable. I think this is actually a social choice, or perhaps a product of social choices that we have made. Next slide. So for instance, sorry, somebody's in the way. Sorry, Alex. For instance, we chose, for the most part, not to teach the history of progress in schools. Stephen Johnson, the technology history writer, looked at an American history textbook and found that the word labor appears hundreds of times, and the words vaccines and antibiotics are not mentioned. Next. We also choose in general not to provide this context when reporting on things in media. So to go back to that story about the draft horses in France, it's absolutely full of sort of glowing quotes, like this one about how lovely the horses are. I gotta admit, horses are lovely. They're very romantic. But there's just absolutely zero balancing context, right? Nothing to provide a balanced story. You will not, for instance, in this story, find the fact that a working draft horse produces some 30 to 50 pounds of manure and at least a gallon of urine per day. And that, in a city like Manhattan around the turn of the last century, where there were fewer than 2 million residents, there were over 100,000 working horses. Do the math, you're dumping something like 4 to 5 million pounds of manure on the street. Okay, maybe that doesn't mean you can't bring back 1 or 2 horses into this small town in France, but you would never have an article on any other topic in the media that didn't have a little bit of balanced perspective, right? You would never get an article that said anything at all about energy without a few paragraphs about climate change. And yet you can have a whole article about horses without any mention of it. Next slide. We have also chosen, for the most part, not to celebrate discovery and invention in art and entertainment. Where, for instance, is the major Hollywood blockbuster biopic of this name? Anybody recognize it? This is Norman Borlaug, father of the Green Revolution. He created strains of wheat that grew much better and more productively and more robustly in places like Mexico, Pakistan, and India in the 1960s, when those places were much poorer than they are today. And so he is credited with potentially averting famine and saving the lives of hundreds of millions, maybe up to 1 million people. He is the most sympathetic figure you can possibly imagine for a major popular biopic. He was not a wealthy founder or venture capitalist. He did all of his work for charities. He helped poor people avoid starvation around the world. He made no money himself. He won a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, this guy ought to be up there as one of the people that whose lives we celebrate and dramatize. And there's so many dramatic stories out of his life. And yet, this film has never been made. So, lest you think that this is sort of inevitable and that the mainstream will never fully appreciate progress, I think from the early and middle 20th century, you can see that there was a time when the mainstream view was actually quite different. Next slide. In the 1930s, World's Fair in Chicago and the theme A Century of Progress. Just a few years later, the World's Fair in New York celebrated the world of tomorrow. And people came back from the fair sporting buttons that said, I have seen the future. In the 1940s, DuPont could unironically use the slogan "Better Things for Better Living" through chemistry and put out propaganda films like this one, The Wonder World of Chemistry, where they unabashedly showed off all of the different chemical products they were making, including like explosives. They showed many explosions for things like construction and mining and all sorts of that. And that was a corporate propaganda film. They also had an exhibit they would put out at state and local and national fairs called The Wonder World of Chemistry. One woman came back from the Texas Centennial having seen this exhibit and gushed about how amazing and wonderful it was that DuPont is, quote, improving on nature, coming up with synthetic, non-natural materials. Next slide. In the 50s, even just after World War II and the horrors of atomic warfare, people were still optimistic about the potential for atomic power. They had become nuclear power, and they foresaw it doing amazing things like making the deserts blue. Next slide. In 1959, there was this children's book, "You Will Go to the Moon." Putting forth, this is before the Apollo program. Next slide. Putting forth this, fairly confident vision for children of how you will live in the moon base. Next slide. And yes, we once dreamed of flying cars. This is from a 1959 advertisement that ran in the LA Times, put out by a coalition of power companies. And this illustration was there to just show you some of the wonderful things that, the growth of power and energy and more electricity might bring to us. They're working on it, they said. A little fanciful, but yes. Next slide. So, I think it's time for us to make another societal choice. Next slide. And that choice is to stop taking industrial civilization for granted, to learn to notice it and to appreciate it, to remember where we came from and who we are. I think we need to teach the history of progress in school. It should be a standard part of the curriculum. Nobody should graduate from high school without having a basic understanding of the history of industrial progress and just a basic understanding of how does the industrial economy work? What is the system that brings you your amazing standard of living that is completely unprecedented in all of history? I think we need to communicate it better in the media. This context needs to be in every story that we write about energy and climate, about jobs and automation, about vaccines, all of these controversial topics that sort of have a foundation or should have a foundation in understanding why is the world the way it is? What were the problems that motivated us to set up the current industrial society, and what are the solutions that we're And then we need to celebrate discovery and invention in art and entertainment. Scientists and inventors and founders should be popular heroes. Next slide. When you walk into a bookstore, you can find it's easy to find an entire shelf full of books on environmental studies. It should be just as easy to find an entire shelf full of books on progress studies. And we should have all of the books that make up the linear feet that are needed to fill those shelves. In short, we need to create or to recreate a culture of progress. So this is what I'm doing with what was originally my blog, The Roots of Progress. It is now becoming a nonprofit organization to support this kind of research and writing. Next year, we're going to be launching a fellowship for progress writers to help support your career and accelerate your career. And so if you or anybody you know wants to write full-time about progress from any angle, any aspect, past, present, future, then we'd love to talk to you. And I myself am writing a book about the history of industrial civilization and the philosophy of progress, about why progress is actually possible and desirable. A culture of progress is the foundation for the changes that we need in order to make that sci-fi future a reality. It will help drive talent and funding into research. It will provide the tailwinds for the regulatory reform that we need to tame the autocracy that has grown up over the last 50 years or so and has contributed to the Great Stagnation. And it will inspire and motivate and give courage to the scientists and inventors and founders who are bringing that sci-fi future into reality. In short, we need to remember the past and appreciate the present as the foundation to build the future. Thank you all.
Well, let's just dive into it. Questions. So when I talk to more mainstream people about something like progress, I basically tend to get two things that come up. One is fear, and I've read most of what you've had to say about kind of how we mitigate risk. But the other one is speed. And people just feel like progress is going too fast. And if we speed it up even more, there's just going to be this more speed. And I actually read the horse article too. And that was so much of the positive was about the slowing down, you know, the kids getting to take their time to go to school and the like. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts on reframing speed or thinking about or talking about speed differently.
I don't know. If one of your parents is dying of cancer, wouldn't you like the year to come a little faster, right? I mean, we romanticize slowing down. Yeah, it's nice to slow down sometimes, right? It's nice to take a vacation. It's nice to have leisure. But I mean, time is life, right? And when things are slow, I mean, when literally like transportation or construction, et cetera, is slow, then I mean you're just literally denying things to people for longer, right? When transportation is slow, it actually doesn't mean that you spend longer in transit. It actually just means that you go fewer places, right? So before we had power transportation, it wasn't that most people spent months, to travel all over. It just meant that most people never left their village and didn't have opportunity, and so they were just denied the choice and the opportunity. And people didn't interact, cultures didn't interact, and you didn't have cultural exchange, and there was much more parochialism, right? I don't know. It would take a whole article to sort of like unpack all of that. But I think it's just a simple. Let me put it this way. I think we today have the luxury of appreciating slowness because we have everything else that we have. People in the past would have done a lot to speed this up. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just ask real quickly. Netocracy, it's a neologism. Where did that shift come from a culture of progress to a culture of netocracy?
Yeah. So at a concrete level, what I'm talking about here is the way that we have empowered in our sort of legal system and in our society as a whole. We have empowered. We've put power in the hands of anybody who wants to slow things down and stop things from happening. There are all kinds of things you can do. You can bring all kinds of lawsuits. You can force, environmental review. You can, and all of these things don't technically block or prevent anything, but they just add so much friction and overhead. I recommend reading Eli Dorado's explainer on NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, and all of the paperwork that it generates, which it wasn't even necessarily intended to generate in the first place, but has crept up over time. Because anytime there's any lawsuit around, your environmental impact statement didn't include X, every statement in the future must include X, like whether it's, whether it's relevant or not. There's actually, Eli pointed out, so not only do you have to do an environmental impact statement for anything that might have impact, if you think your project is going to have no impact, you have to do a different statement. That's a finding of no impact. And those statements, even though they're shorter, there's so much more of them that the cumulative paperwork, there's more paperwork around things that have no impact on the environment than there is paperwork for things that have impact. So it's just this cruft that accumulates almost, on its own. Where did this come from? In the early to mid 20th century, there was a movement towards more and more centralized top-down control by elites and especially by governments. A movement that I use the term technocracy. The idea that this sort of technical elite should run the world essentially and have top-down, and that created some progress, built the interstate highway system, got us to the moon, etc. It also had a lot of really bad consequences, especially when it was combined with totalitarian political systems like in communism and fascism. And so in the mid to late 20th century, there was sort of reactionary movement, which I'll just call counterculture for short, that was reacting against technocracy, but it reacted against a sort of package deal of authoritarianism and science and progress. And it said that if those things go together, then we reject all of that. we don't want the top-down control, and we don't want the science, we don't want the technology, and we don't want the progress. We're going to get rid of all of that, and they romanticize the past, very Rousseauian, like just sort of a back to nature movement. And so you've got this radical environmental movement. You've got combined with the anti-war movement, combined with the anti-nuclear movement, combined with this general kind of anti-large system, anti this thing that was kind of like, oh, the system, the man, the structure is like taking away our freedom and our spirituality and so forth. And so I think that was like I think technocracy was a bad development, and I think the reaction against it was maybe even worse. But that's a large part of how we got those two things together, gave us large federal bureaucracies that then implemented these controls motivated by this reactionary thinking. And then we got stuff like NEPA and all of this overhead. I think that's a good way to
Given that what you just said has been the progression of things, I do have a hard time imagining most people getting excited about a high-tech future without rolling back some of the oligarchy, because it's like things will be marginally better. I'll have fewer iPhone apps, but Mark Zuckerberg and deep state are going to rule everything. So I don't want to live in that utopia. So it seems like a lot to be written about when you look at this, when you look at that. But unless we actually change the behavior, the behavior of bad actors to have centralized power, then how are we really going to make that argument?
I agree. Well, I would go further. I would say if we don't limit the behavior of bad actors to have centralized power, we won't even have a good future, right? Like, so I mean, I think that sort of progress is absolutely as necessary as the nanotech and everything else. And it's an even harder problem. Yep. No, it's super hard. Thank you.
Sometimes progress is absolutely
The question is, sometimes progress makes inequality worse. How can we prevent that? I still need to study this a little more deeply, but I think on the whole, progress really does move things forward for everybody. Maybe not equally, but I think if you compare possible paths we could take, it'll just be better off for everybody to focus on creating a lot of relevant technology and abilities, and not being as worried about exactly how it gets distributed. I do think we should have fairness in our system, and I do think there's a lot of unfairness in the system today, and the way it's possible for larger actors to sort of capture the regulatory bureaucracy and bend it in their favor, and so there's a lot of that going on. But I mean, when we eradicated smallpox, we eradicated it from everybody. The absolute worst person on earth benefited from that campaign. And so I think there's a notion in I think it's in the Game in the Future book about sort of if we just utopias or something like that, that if we just focus on making sure we kind of make as much progress as possible, everybody's going to end up in a better place. I mean, okay, look, here's a really concrete example of this. Look at the way that we rolled out COVID vaccines, right? And look at there was so much hand-wringing about making sure that exactly the right people got the first shots in exactly the right order, and nobody got to jump the line, et cetera, and so forth, that we were literally throwing out vaccines rather than just give them to whoever was around, right? And then you contrast it the way they were rolling it out in Israel, where literally, I mean, if they had extra shots, they would just step out the door, grab the first person off the street, pull them in, give them a shot, right? And so I think too much hand-wringing about inequality and social justice, I think actually can just cause us to lose focus on what's actually important for making a better future.
If I can ask again, how do you think we should go about restricting or opposing successfully the centralized bad actors so that they're not in the way of this positive?
Yeah.
Easy question.
No, hard question. I think part of the answer is similar focus on just like understanding the history of progress and broadening that to not just being technological and material progress, but social progress as well. I actually think if you look, social progress is harder to see, and it's and harder to measure, and it feels much more 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I think overall it is, I think we are in a much better place than we were used to be 4 years ago. You know, in 1775, the whole world was monarchy. I just think about that for a moment, right? You know, so there's been actually quite a lot of progress in better governmental structures, in more equal rights, and so I mean, calling out how we did that is part of it. And then I think also looking at, so what are some of the things that that actually motivated the growth of the bureaucracy and the centralization of power have to do with trying to prevent some of the problems that were caused by technology. So, you know, how did we get the modern FDA that is, you know, I mean, arguably doing as much to slow down beneficial medicine as it is to prevent, you know, bad ones? Well, if you roll back to the sort of beginning of the century and look at all that came from, there were some serious problems that people were motivated by. You know, meat packing plants were filthy. And, you know, milk would be distributed warm in open containers on railroads and get, you know, tuberculosis growing in it and stuff. And the drug industry was absolutely full of shams and fraud. And even some of the drugs that were manufactured were not done using good practices, and some of the drugs weren't tested and so forth, right? So like there were a lot of real problems. And I think it would be really helpful to like rewind, look at those problems, look at how we solved them, look at some of the problems those solutions ran into, and ask if there were better ways to approach them. Because I think in the large, at least in the United States, I think in large part what we did was we just installed more and more kind of layers of micromanagement, and came in and said, okay, if you're making drugs, here's exactly what you have to do. And we just added more and more, here's exactly what you have to do. And I think I have a half-baked sort of idea for a different approach and path we could have taken that, which we did take in some areas like factory safety, for instance, which is much more focused around identifying liability, holding people responsible for harms that are caused, and in some cases even requiring insurance for that kind of liability, and then leaving sort of much more open people to figure out, okay, how do I avoid causing harm and incurring that liability? It's not a full answer to your question. Yeah, I mean, I think the progress movement that just sort of started in the last few years is coming along. It's growing. It's gaining recognition and gaining momentum. Just earlier this year, a new policy institute was launched in DC called the Institute for Progress. They're doing a bunch of great work. Like I said, we're sort of taking the Roots of Progress and turning it into a full-fledged nonprofit to support progress writers. We just announced a couple days ago that we have hired a CEO to run the new organization. So she's going to start full-time in January. She's here. Her name is Heidi Larson. If you see her, please meet her, talk to her. And so there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's starting to get more, you know, in the mainstream press as well. I've been interviewed at BBC and Vox and so forth, and there's even more stuff coming out, you know, soon. So yeah, I'm excited about it. Thank you.